Bram's worked for more than 2 decades as a user-centered design and research professional. And a few years ago, he gave a talk at the IA Summit called "Was Nate Silver Wrong? Click here for why. The crisis of modeling in an era of clickbait, truthiness, and fake content." And so Bram's here tonight to kind of revisit that topic, kind of what's happened in the intervening 5 years. Where are we with this topic, and how can we as information professionals sort of be aware of that and cope with it in whatever ways we can. So a little bit about Bram. He is a founding partner at Factor, which is a Seattle-based user experience and IA-focused consultancy for which he's delivered human-centered digital experience designs and strategies for clients like Adobe and Amazon, Backcountry, City of Seattle, Crate and Barrel, Expedia, Disney, GE, Group Health, Intel, Lionsgate, MasterCard, Microsoft, Nordstrom, Real, Safeco, Sony, Starbucks, Volvo, UW Medicine, and Warner Brothers. So some pretty high impact work there. Bram also is a frequent speaker at various conferences and teaches an advanced user experience. It teaches advanced user experience and certificate information architecture classes at School of Visual Concepts, and is a guest lecturer at the University of Washington's Masters in Communication. Now I'm blanking. It's MCDM, Masters, fill me in.
MCDM and I can't remember the other one.
Well, the MLIS, but MCDM is Masters in
Communication for Digital Media.
Digital Media.
Unless
there
they
you go.
Changed because that was a few years back. So
yeah. Okay. All right. Anyway, so all that said, please join me in welcoming Bram, and I will kick it over to him for. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Just before we do that, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A section at after Bram has spoken, and Larry will kind of help curate through those questions and give you a chance to ask when we get to that point. So take it away, Bram.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and this is going to be triggering for some people. So just a trigger warning here. Let's see, here we go. Okay, now sharing my screen. I'm going to make this, I know this is painful, but I'm going to make it full screen. Okay, and now I should be ready to go here. Okay, looks good. Okay, so thank you, Paula. And I haven't taught at SVC in a while, but I've been advising them on curriculum. And one of the things that I did recently was talk to Larry Asher, the director over at School of Visual Concepts, about their new program in content writing. And so one of the things that I want to say at the beginning is that I initially gave this talk to an audience of information architects. It was at the IA Summit, which is now called the IA Conference, in 2017. And some of the original talk that I gave was, pretty specific to information architecture and made probably some assumptions about like level of field literacy in information architecture. So I'm going to try to kind of reconfigure that for an audience of more content professionals or maybe people who are doing UX writing. So with that sort of caveat, I'll say that I began my talk at the IA Summit in 2017 with an F-bomb. I kind of said, "The fuck happened?" And I quickly clarified that what I really meant was, how did everybody get this so wrong? So this is a screenshot of 538's polls only forecast on election day in 2016. And when I gave this talk, it was only a few months after the election that shocked everyone in the world. It might have felt like, really apocalyptic to everybody at the time. It probably seems pretty quaint now, given what has transpired between then and now. But back then, the question was on everybody's mind. So the question I, sort of nominally set out to answer was Nate Silver wrong? And if anybody doesn't know, Nate Silver Created 538.com, which is it's kind of a news analysis site, but it's data journalism. It's really focused on using data and information to understand the news and world events and public opinion and things like that. And Nate Silver in 2012 created election forecasting. He created the first model to aggregate polling data together to make a prediction about who was going to win the election. And he, in 2012, was got it, within a percentage point of being 100% accurate. And I think only got one state wrong when he predicted that Barack Obama would beat Mitt Romney. So what I really wanted to talk about had very little to do with the actual wrongness or rightness of Nate Silver or 538 or any of the other forecasters. As you can see from this chart here, all of them got it wrong. In fact, the 538 forecast gave Donald Trump by far the highest odds of victory. It says 71% likelihood of Hillary Clinton winning, but the actual odds of victory for Donald Trump were 28.6%, according to 538. So my question was, if so many entities, the entities that we traditionally trust to interpret the world for us, I mean, you saw, Princeton and the New York Times in that previous slide, along with 538, and they had access to such vast amounts of data. If they could be wrong about something so important, something so visible, something so seemingly obvious, then, how can we ever trust them again? And back in 2016, we were supposedly, awakening to how we become a data-driven society. But this election raised the question, how do we trust the data itself? And more broadly, how do we establish meaning in an environment like this? So what do I mean when I say something like an environment like this? Well, by 2016, something that we information architects already knew was dawning on the rest of society, that we inhabit an environment where, as people like Dan Klein and others are fond of saying, there are places and things that are made of information. And we also understand that there's an attention economy that powers this information environment. And two of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world, Alphabet and Meta, became that way because they largely control this attention economy. They've monetized it by creating free services built on what are essentially advertising or targeted data platforms. So the election of 2016 was a watershed event in what I would call the incursion of the information environment into the natural and built environments that we traditionally believe that we inhabit. And one way to read that situation is that we reached a point of consequence in 2016, provoked by the ways and the extent to which our information environment had, to borrow a phrase from Ted Nelson and Peter Morville, had become intertwingled with what we used to call real life. For example, though the level of education is at an all-time statistical high and growing, it's trending up, it's tough for most people, even well-educated people these days, to tell what's real or not in this sort of digitally saturated environment. So a case in point, look at this chart and post in the chat, what do you think is wrong with this picture? I'll give people a few seconds to post in the chat. Let me see if I can get the chat open so I can see this. Well, I'll go ahead and, yes, the x-axis scale, you're exactly right. So if you look down here, you'll see that it starts with a 10-year increment from 1960 to 1990, and then it goes to a 2-year increment. So it flattens basically the acceleration of the curve. Now, this is not actually wrong. This is based on actual data, and it's not even really, I think, intending to portray the data in a misleading way, but it does manipulate how the data is presented so that it looks like the curve is changing. I think the intent of the folks who created this chart was just to show more granularity between 1990 and 2020. But the sort of unintended side effect is that you see the curve look like it's flattening. Like education is not increasing, educational attainment is not increasing as fast as it was in the previous decades, which isn't actually true. So, at this point in my presentation in 2017, I proposed a straw poll, and I led off with a question about Google. And I thought back then that Googling the mother of all conspiracy theories would be a good visual example of that. So that's what I did. I screenshotted, who killed JFK, and I stuck that in there. And all those of us who've lived through the last 5 years know it turns out that that was really naive. There are conspiracy theories that are much more widely distributed and adopted and have much more of an impact on our lives than the one about the many about JFK. So I thought I'd change what I wanted to do and try this again today, but instead of Googling something that was going to generate, obvious crap results, I try to illustrate my point by Googling something fundamental and basic. And when I was lying awake thinking about it, I considered trying life. What would it mean to Google life, or what kind of results would I get? But for some reason, when I sat down to actually do it, I impulsively typed truth. And I wish I would have thought to screen record what happened, because it was spooky and fascinating. So I just opened a new tab in Chrome and I typed truth and I hit return. I didn't even realize that Google had autofilled in Chrome a likely result. And here's what I got. And so obviously this was not the droid I was looking for. And I have so many questions about this, but also I have lots and lots of feelings, not the least of which is why? Not just why Truth Social in this result, but why me? So clearly, on some level, despite Alphabet Corporation's best efforts to be as opaque as possible about how PageRank works, we all kind of know how this works. Truth Social, this business entity, has purchased something from Google's ad platform based on what it knows about what the Google ad platform knows about the people who use it. But what exactly does it know about me? And how on earth have I signaled to Google, me of all people, that the most likely destination for my personal search for truth would be Donald Trump's propaganda platform? Clearly, this is not what I had intended, so I backspaced, and here's what happened next. Okay, so I actually got the word truth into the search field. But now, even after I had defeated Truth Social's attempt to steer me to itself via Google's type ahead feature, it was still able to contextualize itself against the literal dictionary definition of truth. And this is exactly what is meant by the term contextual advertising, placing a message in the context of something that somebody is searching for. And it's not just that that's what contextual advertising is, that's the intent of Google's contextual advertising service. This is not a result of somebody gaming the platform. This is the platform's business model. Now, the dictionary definition itself is another part of Google's business model. It's an application service that Google provides in order to increase the utility value of Google itself, just like the calculator. You can type in, 2 + 2 =, and it'll run a calculation for you. You can type any word into Google and get a dictionary definition. The obvious question here is, when is that point at which Google will realize it can make more money from entities like Truth Social simply by omitting the dictionary definition for certain terms? What happened to me with type ahead earlier suggests that Google may have already crossed that threshold. So 5 years later, I'm coming back to my straw poll. And now we have Zoom. So even though we're not all in the same room, we can do a show of hands. So here we go. use the raise hand feature of Zoom. It should be down in the lower part there somewhere, or maybe in the chat. Use that raise hand feature if nothing like what happened to me with Google today has ever happened to you. I'll give you as much time as you need. I saw a hand come up and then, oh, there is a hand up. And then it disappeared. So it was a trick question because I'm pretty sure that this has happened to everybody because it's pervasive. So in 2017, I followed up with the again naive question of why is this so pervasive despite Google's publicly stated attempts to combat it? Back in 2017, the big challenge that Google was having was with content farms. Folks who were trying to game the algorithm by like just basically throwing crap content out there to get clicks. It's the same as, you know, spam hitting your email box. And back then I speculated that this was because much of this process had been given over to machines that communicate with each other with minimal human intervention. But 5 years later, I mean, I think we know more about why. Google faces a fundamental conflict of interest between its utility service and its business model. This is the impact of the attention economy on the information environment. Content's not actually the product. We are. A huge volume of microscopic units of our attention is the product that Google offers for sale in the open market to people like Truth Social or anybody. And naturally, inevitably, this is going to lead to a race to the bottom in value because that's the way the business model of the ecosystem itself is structured. Human interpretation doesn't come into play in this scenario until you and me are forced to wade through oceans of crap in a futile attempt to find what we are looking for. And you and I might actually know what we're looking for, but as information architects or content strategists or content writers, we probably haven't heard of something called known item seeking, which is, you know, a search query where you know the item that you're looking for. But that's different from serendipitous discovery. So what happens when we don't know what we're looking for? How are we being influenced in subtle and powerful ways? So at this point, in my 2017 talk, I took an excursion into the world of social media. I talked about the crisis of authenticity. And what does it mean when you put the weight of your platform behind authenticity? And about the dopamine feedback loop in social media that gives each of us this illusion that we have a network effect at our disposal when we're really kind of just either shouting into the void or reinforcing our own echo chambers or bubbles. And how the owners of this ecosystem, companies like Meta and Alphabet, have little or no economic incentive to curtail its worst effects. And we found from the Facebook leaks that in some cases they knew and just ignored it. So the feedback loop continues, and suddenly most people, regardless of the level of education, get what they consider news from this massive referral engine, this mediated layer, which has a huge artificial motive driving it. And what all this amounts to, even though back in 2017, I said there's no one malign entity in direct control of any of this, it amounts to a denial of service attack on meaning. And so I had DDoS, which is distributed denial of service attack. And how I'd modify this from 2017 is that it is actually distributed. There's no one malign entity. There are all kinds of different entities with their own agendas, many of whom are maligned, like the Russian intelligence service, perhaps. And it is a distributed denial of service attack on meaning. So the volume of low quality information out there has gotten so high, or just downright deceptive information has gotten so high that the signal to noise ratio is way out of proportion for anybody, regardless of what your level of education is. There is a experience cost, an experience tax to having to wade through the ocean of crap to find something that's actually true or meaningful or valid. So then I turned my attention back to asking, how did all this lead to the result that we got in this election and the inability of even the most rigorous and traditionally trustworthy to see that it was a likely result? And I reflected on how it's an enormous challenge to forecast based on polling data when there's such a wide variance in polling methods themselves. So I'll walk you through this as quickly as I can. So for example, online polls are different than results from live interview polls, and polling mobile phones gets different results from polling only landline phones. So when you start to dig in, you realize that from the source data all the way up to the meta aggregators of all the forecasts, there's a lot of manipulation going on, a lot of modeling going on. They're kind of trying to get at the truth, but they encounter second and third order modeling effects that can distort the conclusions that they reach. So to illustrate this, I threw it back to when Nate Silver himself keynoted the Information Architecture Summit 6 years prior to my talk in 2016. So what he said was, so number one, and this kind of goes back to the supply chain, but if you're working with actually trying to manufacture something out of data to come to some analysis or some conclusion, you have to make sure that the data is good to begin with. So in this quote, Nate was dancing around what I think is a very important concept for us. There's an information supply chain. In every organization, in every environment, especially digital environments, in the news media, in many aspects of our lives, there's an information supply chain. So let's take a walk in 538's shoes and explore their information supply chain to hopefully shed some light on the information supply chains that we as content professionals interact with. So going back to Nate, first principle, the data is often wrong. And to put a much finer point on it, the nature of opinion polling is that no poll is ever precisely correct except one. The one that's taken on election day. So the 538 model and other forecasting models introduce all manner of corrections for the inherent ambiguity, the inherent wrongness, if you will, of polling data. And in 538's case, they're very inclusive. They made a choice that more data is better, so they aggregate all data except from pollsters that have been shown to be sloppy or unethical. And actually, since 2017, they've banned some pollsters that have been shown to be not just sloppy or unethical, but actually fraudulent. They were actually generating polling data to make it look like a candidate of their choice had momentum so that maybe people would come out to the polls or not go to the polls or whatever. So right away, there's a methodological choice that a forecaster faces when they decide, what are you going to include and what are you not going to include? And this is very similar to methodological choices that we might make when we decide what discovery inputs we're going to trust and prioritize in our work. Are we going to be driven more by analytics or by qualitative user research, by big data or thick data? What balance are we going to strike among our inputs? One of the very most basic ways election forecasters do this is by choosing which polls to prioritize. And one thing they do is prioritize state polls over national polls. And the reason for this, turns out it's a really wise thing to do, because in the US, we have this thing you might have heard of, it's called the Electoral College. So it's actually electors, and there's 538 of them. That's where the site 538 gets its name. And those are individuals chosen by the states that elect the president. The popular vote, as we all know, does not elect the president. So if you wanted to create a model that just tracked the popular vote, like this one, which is from Real Clear Politics, and I think it still does this, you'd be wrong some of the time because, well, there's two people you can ask about what happens when the popular vote and the Electoral College don't match. This person and this person, both of whom lost the election even though they won the popular vote. Then a forecaster has to decide which version of each poll to use. So if you're surveying all adults, you stand a good chance of surveying a lot of people who are not going to vote because they're not registered to vote. So a poll of all adults doesn't tell you, it's not as precise. Almost no serious polling firm does that. They screen at least for registered voters, and even then it's a well-known fact that only some fraction of registered voters are going to actually end up voting. So if a polling firm publishes multiple versions of a poll, forecasters, they want to use the likely voter version because it's considered more predictive. And this is important in the US because we have a problem with turnout. In fact, if you multiply the percentage of eligible adults who actually voted in 2016 by the percentage of the vote that Trump got, it turns out that less than a quarter of eligible adults in the US elected Trump for the rest of the population. So we've probably all done some form of user research or used user research that somebody else did, and that should that would be a plurality. That's what pollsters call a plurality of us. You've probably used a recruiter and given them a screener to help find the target audience, because we can't afford to talk to people who aren't the target audience. It's not only a waste of time and money, but it's risky. It could lead us to the wrong conclusions or designing or writing or creating the wrong thing. So naturally, pollsters that limit their results to likely voters get different results than firms that publish results from all registered voters. So how do pollsters decide how likely someone they're surveying is to vote? They have to decide how to interpret, they model it. And then the forecasters have to decide how to interpret the choices that the polling firms have made. So just like we do with discovery inputs, forecasters give their inputs, the polling firm's data, different weights. And you can see here in the 538 average, how they have differently weighted different polls. And in 538's case, they weight polling firms based on a firm's historical track record for accuracy, but they also weigh based on methodology. So part of how they model the data they receive is by modeling their own value judgments about the different methodologies of the sources, the polling firms that are generating the source data. So you can kind of see how we've got this information supply chain, and there are all these downstream effects. So 538, they have to keep this rating current because the performance changes over time. And another weighting factor is time itself. So because each poll is a snapshot in time and people's opinions change over time, some elections have higher, what we call volatility than others. 2016, for example, much more volatile than 2012. And mostly that was because there were so many undecided voters. So it stands to reason that a poll taken 2 months ago is probably not going to be as predictive as one taken yesterday. There's an information science reason for that. And you can see here how quickly opinions change. If what I did for the screenshot, you hold the slider over October 28, and that's the day that James Comey's letter saying that the FBI may or may not be investigating Hillary Clinton's email server came out. They didn't end up doing an investigation, but look at how much the race tightened in the shaded area after the Comey letter. So you got to wait for recency. And this is especially valuable if the same firms are taking multiple polls of the same population with the same methodology, because it's instructive to see how a population's opinion shifts over time in an important state like, say, Pennsylvania, one that had a primary last night, or Michigan, or Wisconsin, all three of which were won by Donald Trump, even though he was considered an underdog to win them. All right, so next they make adjustments based on trying to reduce the entropy even further. So they have to remodel likely voters because each polling firm has a different model for likely voters. So they try to normalize that. Another adjustment is because some firms only ask about major party candidates. So if they don't have data about third party candidates, they have to normalize that. And the challenge with that adjustment is that that data doesn't actually exist. If a pollster hasn't asked about third party candidates, that is not an apples to apples comparison to a pollster that has. So forecasters have to figure out how they think that vote might distribute. And it's not going to be uniform because libertarian or Green Party voters will not divide equally among candidates for the Democratic or Republican parties. And since opinion evolves over time, some forecasters do a trend line adjustment, which is like saying, well, since everything's been trending towards Biden and we get an outlier showing support for Trump, we're going to pull that back a little bit toward the middle just to smooth out the curve. And then if a forecaster has observed their polling firm has what's called a house effect, meaning their polls tend to lean one way relative to the average, they also get adjusted. There's lots and lots of smoothing that happens, but this is a slippery slope because every adjustment you make has downstream effects. And that's because every time you change a data point to an average, it changes the average itself. So then a forecaster has to figure out what to do with undecideds, and it's a similar challenge to third-party voters. They have to model all the folks who weren't able to say, oh, I don't know, Clinton, Trump, no difference, I don't know, throw up their hands. And they have to model how those are going to distribute. So that's more speculation, more missing data that they have to model. So I'm here to tell you, election forecasting is grounded in classic information theory that's straight out of the work of Claude Shannon. So none of this is new. And what forecasters are trying to do is reduce the entropy of poll results by aggregation and comparison. So if you take one poll, it provides lots of new information. But since taking a poll is a predictive act, the subsequent polls all provide relatively less new information because in part they should be predicted by earlier polls. So by aggregating those, you reduce the entropy. So if you gather and compare all of the information people say they believe about a given subject, like say, should Roe versus Wade be overturned, and you aggregate it, the theory is that you can eventually reduce the entropy in the channel to a more predictive level. So I want to share one of my favorite quotes from Peter Morville. He was talking about findability, but I think this applies generally to what we do as information professionals. And he says, findability is at the center of a quiet revolution in how we define authority, allocate trust, and make decisions. What we're doing in our work is creating those systems of authority. 538 has created a system of authority that's so powerful that many people felt personally betrayed when it seemed to fail in 2016. There are still people on Twitter who comment on everything that Nate Silver posts on Twitter that says like, oh, well, he was wrong in 2016. Don't listen to him. He's wrong about everything. Okay, so what I want to focus on now is we're information professionals. So what are our information supply chains? We have to define concepts. We have to create the structure of what's here and the definitions. We have to establish the rules of understanding. What are all the things? What are they called? What can you do with them? How are they related to each other? So what can we do as content professionals or information professionals in the trenches as practitioners? What can we do when we have limited control over the vastness of the information environment? How do we figure out what impact we can have in our limited sphere, whatever it happens to be? We need to understand, as content professionals there, we need to understand how the broader information environment is affected by everything we put into it. It's on us to help users get on top of the signal to noise ratio, because no matter how much we try to create highly effective self-contained systems of understanding, the broader information environment is going to increasingly dictate how these systems of authority are used and how effective they are. Whatever we're working on, it's our responsibility to give information users the ability to determine what is quality and to sift through the volumes of information that they encounter to find what's valuable to them. So let's zoom out a little bit. Most of us work in or with some kind of organization. So what are the implications of the emerging, information glut for organizations? Just like the rest of us, organizations have to wade through the same sea of crap if they want their constituents to be able to satisfy their goals. In this attention economy with heavily mediated experiences that everyone is immersed with, and the continuous partial attention demanded of all of us every day, it's difficult to get any kind of real signal through because there's so much entropy in the channel. So a lot of the work that we do in my company, Factor, is literally just helping organizations even understand what their own information supply chains look like. In Scott Kuby's talk, I don't know what he's going to talk about, but he talks about creating information ecosystem maps. That's something that we do, and it's really helpful for organizations just to see what's all the information that I can control and own, and how is it related, among itself and to the information out there in the world, and how do I govern that? How do we as an organization make sure that the quality of that information remains high and communicates what we want it to communicate? How do we create and manage and distribute and then maintain this system of authority? So this is important for every organization, no matter what your organizational charter is. If it's for-profit, nonprofit, if it's public benefit or public service, your organization is inescapably about something. There's an aboutness to how your information assets themselves and your content, what they say, how they're organized, how they're structured, how they're instrumented, and that communicates the goals, values, and priorities of your organization. To elevate your signal above the noise, you need to reduce the entropy in all of your communications. You need to model the information you're putting out into the world so you're not obscuring this aboutness. You need to give the people and the machines who are interpreting the information you're providing the semantic handles to be able to use it effectively. So we have to prioritize just like election forecasters do. Each decision we make when we're modeling something is a commitment to what we value. And we're going to have to consider the environment that this inhabits, not just the technical environment or the user context, but the broader information environment. And finally, what is our responsibility as a community? How can we call attention to this challenge of an information environment burdened by so much entropy? How can we build durable, sustainable ecosystems of understanding that allow people to get on top of their signal to noise ratio? So this means we have to broaden the question to what are our goals as a society, the society that we inhabit. I mean, since about 1996, it seems like we've been trying to create a digital ecosystem where attention can be optimally monetized. Well, look where that's gotten us. So it's not possible for a natural ecosystem to thrive in a polluted environment. Why would it be possible for an information system to thrive in a polluted digital environment? So how can we take back control of the signal to noise ratio? We've all been in that meeting with maybe our software developer friends where we have to decide what we want to compromise based on what the code can do and can't do. And when we do this, do we think about the consequences of these decisions for the broader information environment and its inhabitants? Each time we decide to let an algorithm do something for us, we're intentionally ceding a measure of human curatorial control because we've decided that something is too burdensome for humans to manage. And that's fair, some things are. So we need to make sure when we do that, we understand the ambient entropy an automated process is going to create. We need to ask the same trade-off questions we ask about how hard it is to develop something when we think about how disruptive something is going to be once it's unleashed. And fortunately, we have experience doing this. I mean, we've all been on projects. We know how to assess, we know how to analyze, we know how to measure the impacts of the trade-offs that we make. And we know this eternal fundamental law of nature. You can have something good, cheap, or fast, and you have to pick two. So we need more of this at the organizational and the societal level. And none of this is new. There are models that we can adapt from the sustainability movement. If we think about our impact on the information environment, what's the triple bottom line of our decisions? What is our entropy footprint? How do we break through the noise to elevate the signal for all of us? Okay, so something else happened in 2017 at the Information Architecture Summit. We had a workshop on Intro to Information Architecture, and it was attended by a customer from one person from a company that makes microchips. And the first thing we talked about with this customer was, okay, what's your information ecosystem look like? And it looked like this on the left. It was kind of a drunken bowl of spaghetti. That's how she described it. And we embarked on what would be a 5-year relationship to help them create that system of authority, that system of meaning. So we actually got an opportunity in a very long-term way to put this into practice. And so this isn't just about helping this organization sell microchips to people who make computers. This is also about helping this organization maintain a message through different cultures, define what geographies they operate in, stay compliant with state and federal regulations, make sure that their products aren't compromised. There are all these different sort of societal things that they have to do because they realize that they exist in an information environment. And to be able to like clearly speak with one voice and define what the source of truth is was fundamental to how they needed to operate moving forward. And the other thing that we discovered is in this organization, we had to identify concepts that were durable and stable. And we had to figure out a way that those concepts could be traced throughout this vast ecosystem. And so what we did was we created a unique ID for certain concepts, like what is a campaign? What is geography? What geographies exist? What are some of the the other taxonomies that they might, like initiatives or business units or industries, et cetera, et cetera. So we actually, the talk in 2017 was kind of theoretical, but we actually got a chance to demonstrate this in practice. So it's up to us as information architects, as users, as humans, it's up to us to decide what kind of an information environment we want to live in. And to echo what Andrew Hinton, said recently at World IA Day, those of us who are lucky enough to have jobs curating this information environment will be the ones responsible for it. So on a local and a global level, we have this responsibility. And just like we care about what goes on in our backyard or on our block or in our neighborhood, or city, province, nation, and world, this curatorial imperative exists at every level of the environments that we inhabit. And the good news is that people are stepping up to the challenge. So this is from, this was in my original talk. It was a Seattle Times article from February of 2017. And some of the things that were referenced in this article still exist today. So 2 professors created a class about how to spot fake data. It was called Calling Bullshit. And I don't know if it's still offered. I found an online syllabus that said that the last time it was offered was in 2019, which was pre-pandemic. But they wrote a book, and I follow Carl Bergstrom on Twitter, and he has been, Twitter, we all know Twitter has its problems, but he has been tirelessly advocating for clarity and in actually understanding pandemic data, because he's a biologist, understanding, what the data is telling us and making actual claims and drawing conclusions about policy. And he has a huge following because of this. So this is the class syllabus that last time was autumn of 2019. So I don't know if it's still offered or not, but this is something we can do. We can educate people. We can write books about this. There's something called the News Literacy Project. They just released a statement about the massacre in Buffalo. And you can go to their site, and basically what they're trying to do is help people, just ordinary people with whatever level of education, be able to interpret the news so that they can separate fact from fiction. There's the Content Authenticity Initiative. One of the people in the audience, Michael Barkin, introduced me to this. It's a community of companies that are working to promote adoption of an industry standard for content authenticity and provenance to combat things like deepfakes, for example. There's the coalition, the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. And what they're trying to do is very similar to what we did at this big chip making customer, which is provide traceable metadata that attaches to content so that you can establish provenance and authenticity and then maintain it. That goes with the content wherever the content goes. So image metadata, for example. So I asked myself, had I answered the question that I set out to, and I hope that you've seen that there are many, many answers, but Nate Silver got his start creating predictive models for baseball players, so I'll just leave you with this. In 2016, the chance that Nate Silver in 538 gave Trump of winning the presidency was higher than the 2016 Major League batting average. So that means every time a batter went to the plate, their chance of getting a hit was lower than Trump's chance of winning the presidency. And yet, players get hits all the time, and runs are scored, and games are won. Probabilities in the high 20s come through often. So out of everyone who tried to forecast the 2016 election, Nate Silver turned out to be the least wrong. And that's pretty much as close as anyone can get. Okay, I'll answer some questions. Let me see if I can turn the chat on.
I've got James just dropped in the chat. Could this be the birth of a new discipline similar to accessibility, tasked with enforcing data and content credibility? I think to the provenance stuff you were just talking about.
Yeah, I think that the existence of things like the C2PA suggests that this could be a field. So Michael Barkin and I met with somebody from Adobe whose job it is, like that's this person's job to work on this in Adobe's participation in developing that standard. So yeah, I think this could, and I certainly think that with the work that's being done by people like Professor Bergstrom, that you could start to see colleges and universities really jump on this bandwagon and start teaching people, how to establish content provenance and how to govern and how to maintain systems of authority.
Do you have a feel for any technologies or practices taking hold? Like I think of the Provo ontology spec from the W3C or blockchain, stuff like that. Are there promising methods out there?
Well, the problem with blockchain is that mathematically it is designed to use more and more power to calculate uniqueness, which is not environmentally sustainable. So I have personal issues with blockchain. I mean, architecturally speaking, encryption potentially is the field of encryption, I would say, potentially could be a source for things if they were used in responsible ways. That could be, and I think that's probably what the C2PA is doing. I don't know a whole lot about what they're doing, but I think they're probably using cryptography to be able to attach that metadata in a way that won't be compromised, because you just, if you just attach metadata, anybody can modify it.
Oh, excuse me, I didn't realize that was
Yeah, I was going to say.
Although I'll jump in just to say, Bram, I was a little bit out ahead of you as you were talking. I was thinking about that, the calling bullshit class at UW, and and I posted a link in the chat as well. You can actually watch some of the lectures. They kind of chunked up the lectures into sort of watchable bite-sized pieces. And there's a link in the chat to where you can watch some of those. They're really fascinating. And
oh, that's great. I should watch those if I'm going to be talking about this in public.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was recorded. They did a meetup at Optimism a few years ago, and it was a good kind of succinct intro to it. I'll poke around and see if I can find a recording of that.
Cool.
Yeah. I'm curious, Bram, about that. I love your idea of the triple bottom line, like applying that notion to sort of information economy stuff. Or do clients appreciate that, or do you have any, like, are you trying to sell it, or do you just sort of
so far we're just now sort of thinking about how we might sell that message in our business. I think that there are some clients who are more inclined to it than others, just based on sort of their, like, that's a thing that Adobe's one of our customers. That's the kind of thing that Adobe, they would be interested in. But I think more and more, I was just talking about this in a meeting today, more and more organizations are going to be held accountable by the social media firmament, the public, by governments. And transparency is going to have to become a value. So some information provenance and transparency is going to be a fundamental component of information governance in all organizations. So more and more, I think that we have an opportunity at Factor to kind of push our customers in that direction. And I think that we can also self-select a little bit by making this a core value of our practice, so that we attract organizations that want to do that are, they're similarly motivated.
It sounds like you kind of build it in the way like accessibility or inclusion or things like that are built into the...
Right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
And if anybody has a question, feel free to unmute and join in. I've got a bunch of people.
Well, yeah, I'll just add, I think one of the really interesting things about this bigger information ecosystem is that there are so many problems, and we often look for like one solution that would address the sort of chaotic environment that's going on. And I think there's definitely a place to like define what the problems are and have specific solutions for various aspects of this situation.
Yeah, it's so pervasive that there are people out there who will tell you that, oh, well, blockchain just will solve all of this, and I'm like, no, it won't. I mean, maybe cryptography and combined with metadata will enable some entities to establish and maintain sort of a chain of custody or a chain of authenticity, but they have to sustain that. They have to have the right motives. They have to govern that within whatever societal frameworks exist. So the technology is not the solution.
One thing, you expressed before we went on the air about like addressing content strategists. One of the things you talked about when you were talking about articulating your aboutness, that's like a core competency for content strategists. Can you talk a little bit about like how you elicit that and articulate that for folks? Yeah,
so there's a variety of ways that manifests. One is that, okay, I mean, a lot of folks engage in branding exercises, and the branding exercises, want to focus on, okay, what's the promise we're trying to keep here? What are our core values, and how are we expressing those core values? And branding exercises probably have a little bit of a squishy reputation because they're sort of considered, marketing. or, you know, they're often conducted by advertising firms or you know, families of firms like that. But the idea of that sort of deep interrogation of what are your core values that you want to express, and then baking that into how do you govern your information. First of all, how do you define it, and then how do you govern it, is what is going to enable that. I'll give you an example from REI, which is a company that we were talking about before we went on the air. So REI, when you look at the navigation of rei.com, it's not just, it's doing a couple of things. One is it's getting you to a product that you want to buy. But another thing it's doing is it's reflecting REI's expertise. It's telling you what REI offers and what they care about and what they're experts in. Just the structure of the information itself is also communicating that. So that's one way you can, you know, that's a really, I think, stark example of how what I call bringing the aboutness forward is that you want to be very, very meticulous about how the information you're putting out there communicates, you know, what you're about, what your values are, or what your expertise is, or what your, you know, emphasis is.
Cool. And does that kind of insight even percolate down to like style guides and voice and tone docs and things like that? Or
absolutely, yeah, it should. And I mean, in our world at Factor, you know, that can permeate entire, you know, stacks of technologies where information is instantiated, like content management systems or CRMs, and you know, often we will have like some kind of a taxonomy management system that is like the central place where that source of truth is maintained, and it's shared with all these other systems and departments and groups and platforms and processes.
oh, Paula, you must have questions. Not to put you on the spot.
No, actually, I think James has tried a couple of times to unmute himself there. So
Oh, yeah, no, please.
give him the opportunity. Speaking of REI.
I'm sorry about that. You guys, I've been having some technology problems tonight. We had some storms rolling through here in Minneapolis. But Bram, I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been a really interesting topic. And I do have a question. You know, there's a lot of companies that really don't keep track of their content, and a lot of companies that kind of loan out for content and kind of pay for other providers to write their content, almost like, you know, rent their content in a way, or license it. What kind of advice would you give to people on the ground, content strategists, people working on the experiences, to kind of you know, help them express and kind of lobby for putting a focus on content and actually investing in good content?
Yeah, I would find an example, a really stark example of where the organization that you're working within lost control of the information supply chain, lost control of sort of the content chain of custody, and it had some kind of an adverse effect. You know, find something that is wrong today, or find the story that's rattling around in the hallways about something that went wrong. One of the stories that we use a lot at Factor is about how there was a client that Gary, our other founder, had a long time ago, and the story that was rattling around in the halls there was, and this is more about findability, but it's somebody created a really important research paper, uploaded it to the research paper database, and then immediately went into a meeting to present it and couldn't find it. So if you find something super stark like that, something analogous to that, we call that like a findability emergency. But if you find something like that with content where you can trace it directly to losing control of the ecosystem or the supply chain, I think that can be compelling. You can also, run some kind of an ROI exercise where you figure out how much not having governance in place is costing the content publication organization or part of the organization. I think it really comes down to kind of that supply chain or systems thinking about this.
Following on to that and to James' question, I've been thinking about credibility, right? And how companies can signal credibility, right? Or what do they do when they've lost it? And kind of, I'd be curious just to kind of hear your thoughts or advice about when something happens that a company, a brand, or an organization needs to sort of come back from and sort of say, we lost your trust there, or, we gave you some wrong information or whatever. Have you seen examples of ways to sort of recover from that, or preventing it, obviously, in that governance piece, but I'm curious to know, I put this question out to anybody, if you have experiences of that.
I don't know if I'll be able to summon an example off the top of my head unless something really springs to mind. I think that I know that it's been done. Alaska Airlines. Okay. I haven't been following that story, but
they have been canceling a ton of flights, overbooking a ton of flights. Yeah. And the media has taken control of the narrative, and their CEO last week sent out their marketing team had a video of their CEO and trying to take back that narrative and apologize and change the narrative of what's happening. And it was an interesting piece of communication.
I have a couple of cynical examples. Let me see if I can go back in my slide presentation. I thought about this. Where is it? I'm gonna have to go way back. Okay, here's one. In 2014, Facebook completely screwed up rolling out gender pronouns. And it wasn't just that, they actually they went through this process of trying to purge. They want everybody to use their actual name, and they went through this process of trying to purge accounts that wasn't, where people weren't using their actual names. And it became clear very quickly that there were people in the LGBTQ community who don't use they have dead names. Like my son, for example, who has transitioned, has a dead name. He's never referred to by his dead name. He's always referred to by his name, but legally that is not yet his name. We're trying to get that name changed. So, they tried to address this, and they tried to do it sensitively. And I think they probably got past the immediate crisis. But I think that the problem is that, I don't know, the beast rots from the head down, right? Like their core values were not such that they could, really sustain. Maybe they could backpedal a little bit and sort of smooth over the PR crisis, of this one, but there would be a bunch of other things, a bunch of other violations of privacy, just because that their business model is fundamentally in conflict. So I would say that that it might be one of the most hard things that there is to do in an organization, which is okay, I would say when something like that happens, it's not just a PR problem. You have to examine, well, what are our core values? And then you might have to make some changes. You might have to make some painful changes, some huge, significant changes, so that you can start operating in a way that more reflects the way you want to be instead of how you have been. So that might not be a satisfying answer, but
No, that's great. I think so. On the topic of Facebook, I mean, it's interesting. This reminded me that within the last day, I was looking at the feed of a family member who tends to post, shall we say, disinformation. And I was seeing more than I had ever seen before. You know, that of course, you know, Facebook will now put that kind of badge on, right? And I'm blanking on what it actually says, but it's something like some of the facts in this may not be true, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to me, you know, that they're doing that, but I wonder if the audience for that kind of automatically would not trust them anyway, you know? I mean, because it's sort of coming from a social media company that, you know, if you want to believe is helping spread disinformation, then if they tell you that something that you've posted is not
they've
factual.
demonstrated over and over again that they're not trustworthy. So why you trust them about this? You know, I mean, it's and I mean,
Have you come across any stats or anything though, or, you know, just discussion of how those kinds of flags, because not just Facebook, I mean, some of the other platforms do that as well, but you know, are those
how they work? I don't know.
Yeah, or do people believe them? Do people appreciate it?
I don't know. I'd be really interested to hear. I left Facebook 2 years ago. So I don't know what goes on there anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm probably going to leave Twitter, depending on what happens with the leadership there. But I mean, and I'll tell you why. I mean, this gets a little personal. It's not really what I came to talk about, but the reason is because I had 2 friends die in the same week, and all of my other friends went to Facebook to mourn, and I realized that they're making money off of us in our grief and suffering, and I just couldn't take it anymore. You know, it's like that's the attention they were monetizing. And so it became impossible for me to separate that from what is going on this platform. What is the business model of this platform? So I kind of rage quit and didn't go back. But I'm not judgmental about it. You know, anybody who wants to be on Facebook, I have no issue with, but it just wasn't for me anymore.
My wife did the same thing, Bram, and you know, with how divided our country is, you know, I kind of yearn for a setting or a feature on Facebook that lets me turn off the other half, you know, of your choice. You know, it's really gotten to that point. But yeah, to your comment, Paul, same thing. Family members, things like that. It's small doses these days. Getting there, and we'll see where Twitter goes.
Right. Well, this has been wonderful. My throat is starting to get dry. My wife is asking me when I'm going to be done, so I think I'll sign off. But thank you so much for giving me the chance to come and talk about all this. And you know, I think I had on my last slide, I had sort of, you know, where I can be reached. So let's see if I can get that back. So feel free to, you know, follow up with me on LinkedIn or email or whatever. So I don't know, that's not it. I'll try to get back to the last slide. There we go. Yeah. So I mean, obviously you can get in touch with me through Factor. This is my Twitter, but I don't know how long I'm going to be there. Paula had my LinkedIn, I think, on the title slide, so that's around. And you can probably find me by, if none of these work, by reaching out to the folks, to Paula and Larry and Jim, etc. So, all right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bram. It's really fascinating. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Bram.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.